All right, welcome to the 5th anniversary of the Global Network for Advanced Management. I'm Ted Snyder, Dean of Yale School of Management. We are delighted to have everyone here. I am going to offer some opening remarks, and then we'll have a first conversation led by my colleague Anjani Jain, Senior Associate Dean, and that discussion will focus on, I think, really interesting issues. I would posit that management education within higher education is the most competitive, the most dynamic, the most complex, and subject to rapid change. The trends that are happening in the world now may have very profound influence on which schools do well and which schools fall behind. And I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. We'll get to that in a few moments. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my way of thinking about the Global Network for Advanced Management. And it has some personal aspects, so forgive me if I meander a little bit. So I was a graduate student at University of Chicago in economics in the late 1970s. And I took classes from Milton Friedman. And in 1976, Milton Friedman got the Nobel Prize. And the Nobel Committee, no doubt, picked that year, which was an important year. It was 200 years after Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, and of course it was the bicentennial of the US. And at that time, there was an understanding that market economies were much better than planned economies, much better than socialist economies. And we were right then, 1976, on the eve of an amazing transformation in the world economy. Who knows where it started and exactly, but we saw transformations happening in India, in China, in the former Soviet Union, in many countries in Africa. And it was an amazing time period in the next 10 years. And so much happened in that first 10 years. 3 billion people effectively joined the world's market-oriented economies. And business schools benefited greatly as the global economy grew. I'm not going to quote statistics, but I think it's a fair statement that now management education has the biggest market share of higher education in the world. So as this transformation happened, students, enterprises all over the world turned to business schools for help. And they responded with what I think is classic two-competence model education. What do I mean by that? I mean, number one, business schools help people understand competition. We help people understand how markets work. And then we also deal with the more cooperative side of human nature. How do we organize teams? How do we pick leaders? How do we follow? How do we network? And these two fundamental aspects of what makes us human were really central to how management education helped people all over the world to adapt to a market-oriented economy. Now, I remember I've been at business schools for a long time, and I remember that when we got into the 1990s, 20, 25 years ago, it was just the sense of rising tide lifts all boats. There were so many business schools around the world doing extremely well because each year they got more resources and more resources and more resources. And what I found that was striking was that it seemed like everywhere I went, business schools were saying, we're going to go for the same brass rings. We have the same great objectives. We're going to get the best students, we're going to get the best faculty, we're going to get the best facilities, we're going to get best recruiters, we're going to develop globally, it's just going to be great. And it actually was great. It was an amazing time to be in management education. And it still is. But what has happened? What has happened along the way? Now, maybe it was because I was naive, but I bought into the term transition economies. And the connotation of transition economies was that the economies were going to transition and converge. And if you were from the US, you thought that all of these economies that had joined the world's market-oriented economy were going to become like the US. Sure, why not? Well, it didn't take me too long to figure out that wasn't going to happen. I went to the former Soviet Union. I spent time in China, a lot of time in China. I went to India. And I thought, India, oh, this is finally, it's all going to make sense to me. And India was like, well, they have all these really smart people. They have common law. They have all the stuff from the British legal system. They have free press. They're a democracy. They have all these really smart people. They're going to definitely converge to be just like the US. And of course not. And as I spent more and more time in China, it was pretty clear they were not going to converge. So what happened along the way is that we saw these 3 billion people join the world's market-oriented economies, but we didn't see convergence. The way different countries organized their own economies and their societies started to actually look so different to me, and many other people, of course. So what happens then? Well, we also have technology. Technology brought all of these divergences so close at hand. We're so connected to what was clearly so different. And for a lot of people who wanted to succeed globally, that meant, wow, I have to figure out the rest of the world. What else happened along the way? Well, one set of things is that a lot of bad things happened. Big issues emerged that faced not only individual societies, but the globe as a whole. Issues with the environment, issues with income disparity, issues with global health, with global education. And these have local components, but they have also global components. So now, what do business schools do? And by the way, the industry, our management education industry, along the way got organized in a pretty strange fashion. As of 4 years ago, according to the AACSB, we had nearly 13,000 business schools in the world. Okay, so we're all connected, it's all divergent, big issues are emerging, and now we have 13,000 business schools trying to deal with this situation. How is that going to happen? Well, I actually been both a proponent and sometimes a critic of how individual schools responded. Certainly the market for faculty got globalized. The market for students got globalized. Schools developed programs that extended their programmatic reach. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of those efforts, especially in the US, didn't have much influence on the curriculum, what was taught, and the professional development of students graduating. So back to the global network. 5.5 years ago, I started having conversations with a lot of people in this room. I said, you know, there's this thing out there called a network. It seems like the most important way to organize socially and in business, but I don't see them in management education. What about forming a network? And that was the big question. Could we move from partnerships to network? Could we move from an approach to globalization that focused on just tuition-rich markets, talking about from the point of view of US schools, to connect with a world that had clearly gotten flatter? Even if you don't buy into the Tom Friedman view, the world had definitely gotten flatter. And many more interesting countries had been left out of the partnership model. Could we engage them in the network model? Could we develop a platform for innovation that not only affected the executive MBA, which was, by the way many schools extended their programmatic reach, to actually an approach that would engage the school holistically? Okay, these are big questions. We started with just, let's get this network going. Our official launch was April 5 years ago. And here we are 5 years later. And it's an interesting question. What did we expect? What did we anticipate? What's happened that we did not anticipate? Well, I remember the conversations being informed by the following idea. We would try to connect what I call our high-quality slices. The education market is not one where we all go after big market share. We tend to go after small slices of faculty and students, and we try to organize them and position them. So one general idea was, well, let's connect these slices around the world. And unlike the MOOC, massive open online course, that goes after market share, might we want to develop small network online courses that don't try to achieve market share, but try to connect high-quality slices? That was one idea. Another idea was maybe we could do case studies together. Rather than look at these global issues from the point of view of our one perspective, maybe we could do some joint work on cases that would be helpful and illuminating. So I don't remember a whole lot else, but I can tell you for sure that nobody when we started had the idea of a Global Network Week, where schools would opt in by organizing their calendars and find a week when they could put on a program, their faculty could stay at home, and the students would have options to travel to the other schools and learn in an incredibly diverse environment from a faculty who is expert in something that presumably would not be found at his or her home school. That started in March 2013 with 5 schools. We had 18 or 19 this past month. We've had 23 schools offer Global Network Weeks. We've had 4,000 students participate in Global Network Weeks, plus countless alumni, and I don't know how many hundreds of faculty. We didn't anticipate that. We didn't anticipate what we now refer to as global virtual teams. It's so obvious now that the students coming into our programs have way more global and virtual team experience than 5 or 10 years ago. And what we realize now is that in this world that features more friction but still offers substantial and compelling opportunities globally, that it's not going to be as easy to be effective in this environment. And having training and professional development where students get better at new forms of teamwork is something that we can, as a network, excel at. So now we've had hundreds of students participate in global virtual teams. It's great. I don't think we anticipated cooperation on exec ed. Now we cooperate on exec ed. I don't think we anticipated what we now believe is really exciting, and that's global network inquiry into big issues. oftentimes done with knowledge partners. It's been a wonderful 5 years. I still think we're sort of like how I think about my smartphone. I'm only using a little bit of it. I know it can do a lot more, but I'm starting to get the handle of it. I can now edit pictures on my phone. Wow, that's really big improvement. Now, so we got this network going 5 years ago. It's so great to have everybody here. We had a great meeting today. I think it's going very well. And when I think back on why has it gone well, I just maybe go back to some ideas that we had when we founded the network. One, and there were two sort of, I'd say, economics-oriented ideas that became founding principles. We have four. One was comparative advantage. David Ricardo, his explanation that it's not so much the case that you have to be better at everything or something to benefit from exchange. The differences in schools can allow us to get better as a group. And that means that no one school has to try to be best at everything. We can benefit from engagement. So David Ricardo, comparative advantage. And then the other was, I alluded to it, is Metcalfe's law. If we actually get the network nodes to activate, it's amazing in terms of the implications for opportunities across the member schools. So Ricardo, Metcalfe's law, and then two principles I think explain how we operate. One is diffuse reciprocity. It's a term that comes out of social science, political science, where entities join in cooperative endeavors not on a piece-by-piece basis, not because they get a particular benefit, but because the whole set of things makes sense. So I go back to the 4,000 students who changed their school locations to participate in a Global Network Week. Hundreds of faculty participate in that. It's interesting. All of that was voluntary. All of that was opt-in. And by the way, no money changed hands. I think that's pretty amazing. I think the other side of diffuse reciprocity is low bureaucracy. And then I think a very important principle has been isotropy. My colleague Anjani Jain, who's going to run the next panel, explained this to me. But it's basically, to me, it's mutual respect. It's that the relationships that we have in the network are symmetrical from whatever point of view we look at. That's the physics idea. But there's not a hierarchy in the network. Yes, true, Yale SOM organized it. We have become the back office for many of the operations, but we have never been the front office. Every member in the network is an equal member. And by the way, we're becoming less of the back office too, as other schools are now taking on additional responsibilities. So this is, what's today's date? 19th of April, 2017. 200 years ago, a book was published. It's called On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. 200 years ago. One of the chapters was on foreign trade. Who authored that book? David Ricardo. Sort of interesting. Here we are, 200 years to the day after the theory of comparative advantage was first published. So I feel really good about that particular coincidence. The last thing I'll say is, well, actually, two more things. I have been suffering from conference fatigue when it comes to management education. I have been to so many conferences where we sit around and we talk about what is the future of management education? How will technology affect strategy? What are the right new global strategies? Well, I don't think we need to talk about the future. What is going to happen in the next day is that we're going to show the progress that we've made. Network learning is here. It's within the global network. We've already demonstrated the power of that. Network inquiry is here. We can get insights fast that just couldn't be gotten any other way. Tomorrow, you're going to get an assessment of what are business schools trying to do. What are the 5 most important transformations that business schools take on as their responsibility? How do they compare and contrast across the network of now 29 schools? So network learning is here, network inquiry is here, network education is here, and it's going to be, I think, fun to assess how far we've come as a network and where we might go in the future. So no one will be fatigued by tomorrow, except maybe me and my staff. And that's the last thing I wanted to say was thank you to the fact, we just put a lot of effort in, a lot of great teamwork to get to this point, but also where I started, thanks to each of you for joining. It's been great to welcome you to Yale SOM. So those are my opening remarks. And now let me turn things over to my colleague Anjani Jain, and we'll get into a discussion about who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers if all the yogurt hits the fan, or if even some of the yogurt hits the fan. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. That's great. Good afternoon, and on behalf of all of us at Yale School of Management, warm welcome. My name is Anjani Jain. I serve as one of the senior associate deans. I oversee the MBA program, and my task here is to moderate a panel with eminent thinkers and leaders on the topic of shocks to global management education. How should top business schools respond to limitations on global mobility? You have at least a quick description of the roles our panelists play. Perhaps I'll just add a quick sentence or two to give you a little more of a background, and then we'll dive right into questions. I would urge you to have questions ready. There are many experts, deans and directors of the global network schools right here in the audience, so I might actually call on some of you as well. We'll try to bring it to a close in an hour, so unless this creates problems, I'll go up to about 6:30. Okay, so in alphabetical order, and sitting closest to me is Nida Bektas. Nida is sitting in the middle. My apologies. And she's the executive director of Koç University's Graduate School of Business. She had a long and distinguished career as a banker in Turkey and a leader in the financial services industry before becoming the leader of the Koç Graduate School of Business. So delighted to have you here. John Byrne, sitting to her right, perhaps needs no introduction to this audience, but one could say that he almost single-handedly created the whole genre of business school reporting, and maybe described as the dean of business school journalists. Before launching his current enterprise, Poets and Quants, he served as editor-in-chief at both Business Week and Fast Company. To my left, immediate left, is Alessandra Ginante, who is an illustrious alumna of FGV Brazil, the Fundação Getúlio Vargas School in Brazil, has had a distinguished career in talent management and in human relations. And before joining Diageo in her current role, she has had similar roles in Philips Latin America and also in Avon Brazil. Then we have two of our illustrious deans. So first, To the extreme left is Dean Bob Helsley, a distinguished economist who, before becoming dean at UBC's Sauder School, had also served in the faculties at the Sauder School and before that at Haas Berkeley. And finally, Peter Tufano, to his right, is another distinguished professor of finance, dean at the Saïd School of Business at Oxford since 2011. But before arriving at Oxford, he had spent an entire academic career, including his undergraduate MBA and PhD education at Harvard. So I'm going to dive in. Ted, I think, gave a wonderful preamble to some of the context of this panel. Perhaps to add just one or two provocative comments just to get the discussion started, I'll claim the following. Business education traces its antecedents to various educational systems, including those in France and the British Commonwealth. But I would say that the MBA as an educational program is distinctly an American invention. It goes back 100 years and has been one of the most successful educational innovations, as Ted mentioned. It's also one of the most successful exports as an idea, and is now pervasive across much of the rest of the globe. And as it has traveled outside the US, it has morphed a little bit. It has morphed both in structure and content and so on. But for the most part, it retains an American imprint. So it's a claim which you may not agree to, our panelists may or may not agree to. The second thing I would say just quickly as a provocative preamble is that to generations of students that have been attracted to the American MBA, and perhaps it's true at most of your institutions outside the US as well, the attraction was not just to the exceptionally high educational caliber of these programs, which it certainly was, but the attraction, especially to generations of students like me, coming from emerging parts of the world, the attraction was also that getting a US MBA credential opened doors of opportunity in regions of the developed world, locus of opportunity to which we would not have any access, at least in my generation, without the passage through a US institution. So if you agree with these claims, then the corollaries become reasonably obvious. I claim one corollary is that restrictions to global mobility, either for entry or for placement, can dramatically, significantly, adversely impact the educational institutions, especially in the developed world, where for us in the US, it's typically in the 30s and 40%, 45% of the students coming from outside the US. And in many of the institutions outside the US, that percentage, especially in Europe, could be in the 90s. So restrictions would directly adversely affect that. But perhaps there is an upside. I hope to hear from our panelists what they see as the upside to these restrictions, if any. One upside could be that if these young students in different parts of the world see their economic future back in their own regions, then perhaps the promise of a network in imparting an education that is truly global, that prepares them meaningfully for careers in their own regions, could still be a unique aspect of these educational institutions that will continue to attract students here, even though they know coming in they can't really expect to get a job in the developed economies to which they travel. A question. Okay, enough preamble. I'm going to start with some of our panelists here, just to get a quick check on what's happening in their regions or countries. I'll begin with Nida, coming from Turkey, which has been in the news. What is happening in the region that you see as a potential shock to management education?
Obviously, politics indicate a shrinking space for global cooperation. And not only Turkey, not only our region, the world is going through a VUCA period. And having said that, and all the discussions that we had today, the world is going for a less globalized venue. I think as business schools, our mission is even more important that we focus on globalization, because businesses cannot survive and cannot grow unless we assume a flat world. And as Ted was saying, we started the whole network based on the idea of that the world is getting flatter and flatter. And I remember that we had our one panel here again a couple of years ago saying that the world is getting flat, but now the world is heading to an opposite direction. I believe as business schools, our impact makes more sense to bring our students together and to make them aware that they have to fight in a complex and global world for a better future.
I'll ask roughly the same question of Peter quickly to tell us what's happening in the wake of all the tumultuous changes in Britain.
Sure. So I think there are a number of things that are going on at the same time. The most obvious one is the passage of Brexit. We have yet to see with kind of Theresa May's new announcement what the next snap election will bring. And you'd think in the short run that, of course, would be bad news. And as some the industry association for the UK, there's some statistics. We can get those later. At the exact same time, however, in Britain, what's happening is that the government is pushing to try to establish more contacts with many more countries, in effect, reestablish the Commonwealth. So if you look at a number of the things that are happening in Britain, the Commonwealth, whether it will ever become what it was, again, certainly not an empire, is attempting to be strengthened. So on the one hand, you see a pullback from continental Europe. At the exact same time, you see an expansion. And so those two forces, I think, are in opposition. The implications for business education, in some sense, it's flat, because it was global in a different way, and it's becoming increasingly global in another way, encouraged by both the government and by the economy.
Bob, we were joking a bit that you must be exulting at the changes taking place south of the border and also across the
Well, I guess as a member of the Commonwealth, we should all go home and make sure that we still have an independent...
The Queen welcomes you back.
Yeah, so... I guess I'll just reflect a little bit about what's been going on at UBC that's related to the rise of sort of political nationalism and the sort of contraction in perspective in a lot of the world now. And so just literally, I mean, what we did at UBC is we created a program for visiting scholars who might be unwelcome in some manner in their home institutions, and also a program for graduate students to come to the university as a result. I mean, Canada is sort of a refuge now, and I must say, as a sort of transplanted American, that I'm sort of very proud of the brand that Canada sort of has as a refuge for diversity of thought and of peoples. So I guess in a lot of ways, we've been sort of a beneficiary of some of these short-run changes, although I think they're very, very harmful for international economic relationships. For us in the very short run, I think this sort of cyclical changes represent some interesting opportunities. I worry more about, in terms of the impact on management education broadly, I worry more about the sort of secular shifts in demand from international quarters, especially things like improvements in the quality of domestic education in China and input substitution and the way that might influence sort of global demand patterns for business education.
Alessandra, you perhaps have been the most recent student through a management education, but you've also been recruiting throughout your career actively at business schools. How do you see the perspective, from the perspective of an employer, how are these restrictions going to affect the way you conduct your business?
Yeah. So as much as I condemn the things that are going on, Diageo is a British company, and the US is the largest subsidiary. So in 2 months' time, our business got these two shocks because everybody was saying this is never going to happen there and this is never going to happen here, and here we are. So as much as in the short term, we do have to work on the complexities that this brings there in Britain, in the British space, but also here in the US, I think it's an opportunity for us also to think about ways to de-risk our business because the digital workforce is another trend. And so on one hand, I fully understand. I myself have been a student that moved to the Netherlands, to Asia, to the US. So it's good, the same story that you shared. But also from a business standpoint, we need to de-risk. We can't base our business, the knowledge base we have, in one single market. And I think the new wave of diversity for companies that are really inclusive is going to be able to tap from this potential that is globally available without having people to move physically to different places. If we think we work in buildings sitting next to other people full time, and then sometimes we spend weeks without talking to them face to face. We're just phoning other people. So I think also that we need, although I don't like the reason why we would need to think about collaborating digitally in a more effective way, I think that successful business over time are going to be the ones that have the capability. It's really a dynamic capability also to improve its own way of governing and then tapping on the potential of the people no matter where they are. The number of expatriates is tremendously going down. Just these 2 last days, I was in Diageo in a workshop with technology firms in which we are looking at how to do the digital recruiter, the cognitive recruiter. So it's basically, we have dozens of people that work in recruiting for us, and they spend a lot of time online looking for who are the talents out there. But there is a lot of cognitive knowledge already to find these people without having humans looking for them. And we can't have a model in which our business needs to be deployed if a government authorizes people to move to that country. So I think, although the mobility is an issue that I think we all disagree should not exist, I think we need to de-risk the business and also academy to go past that roadblock, I think.
That's an interesting dimension of virtual teams that I hadn't fully appreciated, that the team members don't have to be geographically separated. They might be just in the next building over.
Yeah.
And it's a virtual team. John, so I'm going to ask you the question Ted posed. Given your bird's eye view of business education, who will emerge as the winners and the losers out of this shake-up?
The question goes to you.
Right. Well, first let me say free markets work. We know they work. And what we've seen over the last half century is generations of business leaders who've been trained as globalists. And I don't think there's any turning back. The genie's out of the bottle, and the last hurrah of the anti-globalists is playing out right now, a hurrah that will be ephemeral and will not have any long-lasting impact. So let me just put that out there, okay? Trump is a temporary phenomena, and he was not elected because there is a huge backlash in America from unemployed white workers who used to work in factories. That is an overinterpretation of his victory. And I think, I don't know how it's going to play out in Britain. No one does with Brexit. But I would not be surprised if this upcoming election turns everything around. Because we know that global markets work. And we know that they cause dislocation. But there really is no turning back. So that doesn't mean there aren't going to be short-term dislocations. Because if you look at the GMAC survey in January, it showed that fairly high percentages of students who might have considered an education in the UK in business are reconsidering going there to study. And a third of the non-US GMAT test takers are reconsidering coming to the United States. And in the short term, schools that are more reliant on international students are going to be more impacted. And that's going to generally impact second and third tier schools. It's not going to impact any first tier school anywhere in the world. Number one, the applicant pools are deep and rich with talent. You lose a few, it doesn't make much of a difference, to be honest. And I think that people who are more likely to go to a highly selective school with a prestige reputation are going to be less afraid to take a chance because they know that you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
An ephemeral last hurrah, Peter?
So I think that John's characterization, at least the part that I can see, I'll start at the end, is right. I don't want to have so much hubris as to call mine one of the elite schools, but what we're observing is, the last 3 years, consistently 20% plus increases in applications. And I worried in the wake of Brexit, would we see anything less? And we're at 26% this year. And we have a combination program, 1+1, that's up over 100%. So while it is the case, if you look at the ABS numbers, that's the Association of Business Schools in the UK, it's really quite curious data, because if you ask deans, how worried are you about immigration issues? It comes to the middle of the pack. How important is this as government policy? It's the top of the pack. Are you observing decreases or increases in applications? Twice as many schools are experiencing increases than decreases from international students in the UK for now. That's what the December data had, which is different than the GMAC data. I can't quite reconcile the two. So there's certainly segments here that are very relevant. And as far as the genie being back in the bottle, I live in a bubble in that I live in a very international school. 95% of my students come from outside the UK, only 6% come from the EU, from the rest of the EU, 10% from Africa. Those kids will never, ever, think that they're bound by national constraints. Impossible.
Mm-hmm. Do you see UK potentially benefiting from restrictions imposed in North America and US?
Again, I think there's segments here, and I think the segments are very real. So a few weeks ago I was in China and people wanted me to characterize on TV the differences between UK and Chinese schools. And my response to then and now was, there are more similarities between, for example, the GNAM schools and how we think about students and the student bodies that we admit than between my school and some others. So will it benefit Britain? There's a lot of schools in Britain. It will benefit some schools, and it will harm others.
I just want to suggest that we are going to be quite open to questions from the audience. And we have a number of deans and directors who have pondered these questions too. So in fact, just to randomly go to one of you, I'm going to ask Dean Peter Todd to reflect a bit on what's happening in France, and we'll take a question as well. So let's see if Dean Todd could reflect a bit on the situation. He's the dean at HEC.
Always appreciate the cold call.
With a little bit of an advance warning.
Yeah, sure. Now it's on. Just to give a quick perspective. I mean, winners, losers. I think over the short term, we're going to see perturbations in things. I mean, in France, obviously, our concerns for the last 12 months have been what are the effects of terrorist attacks on interest of international students to come. We haven't seen great changes, certainly through the last year in demand for our programs. Our MBA demands are also up. We see a little more variation in some of our European demand for our pre-experience programs, where we're not seeing some of the growth rates that we've seen before. I do think, though, that we need to reflect on the fact that there's another long-term phenomena that maybe we should tackle here, and a number of us have talked about it today in the context of the fact that we live in a bubble. We are the 1%, right? We're the 1% of business schools. We attract the 1% of some of the very, very best students in the world. We've done an enormous job of developing internationally. I think we've done that at HEC. I think every school in this room has done that one way or another. We haven't done the same job of opening ourselves up socioeconomically. And I think there we have maybe a next wave challenge to face, and I'd certainly be interested to hear from some of our distinguished panelists there how you tackle that. I mean, we've heard Peter with Africa and movements in that direction, and I think all of us probably have to look at that problem in the mirror as a next generation challenge for how business schools develop.
Great, thank you. We have a question from the audience. Fred is a distinguished member of the Board of Advisors. Let's have a microphone.
Thank you. I'd like to ask two totally different questions. One, if the panelists could tell us at their respective schools, what is the tuition? We know what it is at SOM. What is the tuition at your school? Because we find out in recruiting young people who come out of college thinking they're going to go back to business school, more and more they're not going back to business school because financially it's too difficult. So question number one is, what is your tuition? Number two, do you require of your students in your schools to study a second language? You're talking about being global. Language is becoming something important. And do you offer language courses that can learn a second language? And do you require competency in the second language?
So we can take a quick pulse on the first question, and let's normalize it on a yearly basis. So Peter, your annual tuition?
So I have a one-year program. So my annual basis is the entire tuition for the entire degree. It's £52,000, which at the current exchange rate is an extraordinarily good deal.
Nida, at Coach?
You have to hear mine to say that it's, I mean, obviously when we consider the exchange rate, it is considered one of the highest, it is actually the highest tuition in Turkey, but it is compared to US standards pretty reasonable. It's around $22,000.
Per year.
Actually per program,
For the program?
Yep.
I see.
Because our 2-year program is also costs the same.
I see. Bob?
Well, as a public institution, our tuitions are regulated domestically, so it's kind of interesting. The international tuitions are quite different than domestic tuitions, but for those that are freely set, like international tuitions, it's in the high 40s, I would say, for the MBA in US dollars. Right?
Yeah.
That's 1 year or 2 years?
16 months.
Yeah. So in the US...
Actually, let me just say something about that, because obviously there are a lot of people concerned about student debt. And in some cases it's been reported at outrageous levels and has put a tremendous pressure on young people, in particular in this country, where education is, the costs are sort of out of control, mainly because universities didn't exercise much fiscal restraint over the last quarter of a century. On the other hand, what has emerged in the business market is essentially a two-tier system of tuition. There is the sticker price, and there is a discount price. And the discount price is a prevalent price that is less visible to the consumer. There is an arms race to discount tuition at all the business schools, first, second, and third tier. Tremendous amounts of money are being spent on these discounts. Harvard alone spends $36 million a year in discounts on its MBAs. There are only 1,800 of them. That's a lot of money. So the tuition numbers look really big and they look daunting, but in fact what people are actually paying is significantly less.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I want to get perhaps a show of hands from the deans and directors. If in your program, in your MBA program, you require a language other than English, how many of you require a language?
You're automatic.
That's true.
Pretty much.
No, I'm assuming that the medium of instruction for most of you is English.
Yes.
Not always, not always. So that's a good footnote. So
if I may just say one thing, connecting what Peter said and what we said about tuition and the language, maybe the mobility restrictions is not the key driver for concern in this group because it's the 1%, but the workforce will not necessarily move to developed countries forever if we think about the longer perspective, right? So how can we go to the places where the talents are and where the jobs will be, because companies are engaged in big time labor arbitrage. And it's not only shared services anymore, because that the robots are taking over. But it's really about the added value work that is going to be performed from wherever we want to be. Like the women don't want to give up on their family more than the men. I mean, I'm stereotyping now, but even that is going to drive, or people are tired of traveling so much. The digital workforce is going to be, it's going to be decentralizing work. So how can we connect work where, education where work is going to take place, if people can be productive no matter where they are from or where they are in?
And as an employer, do you care where they have been educated?
Still, traditionally, yes. Obviously, I see that we today care more about the diversity, like the easy diversity to see, right? The gender, the race, the ethnicity. But over time, I think we are going to evolve that model to diversity of thinking as well, in a less of a cliche, but really in reality. And so we are going to, I hope, move to not only the diploma anymore, because that's going to stop being differentiating, right? If we think that more people over time, we hope in big cycles, are going to get access to higher quality education, then it's going to be harder to differentiate based on that only. But I think it's more about how can we have an education model that allows people to be productive and highly educated no matter where they are, and that revenue stream is coming to the schools.
So that's a good question to put to some of our deans here. Do you see a trend towards a lack of differentiation based on the credential? That's sort of a premise of Alessandra's argument, that what's going to matter is how productive you can be wherever you are. And the credential of the institution that you graduated from perhaps will matter less. And I'm curious how our deans will respond to that, including those in the audience. So let's begin with you, Bob.
Interesting question. I guess one of the things that we've worked on quite a bit is the diversity of the class generally. And I don't know if there's been more convergence in terms of credentials, really, but we have seen, perhaps as a result of our location, some fairly tight geographic concentrations in Asia. And one of the things that we do worry about a bit is creating a class which is more geographically diverse. Could I just diverge for just a second and go back to something else? So I guess one of the things I've been reflecting on is what the network can do in this environment. And if we think that this sort of retrenchment from a global perspective and the sort of retrenchment from global responsibility is important, and I certainly do think that, I think it's really important for the universities to lead. I think educational institutions actually have a responsibility here to articulate the benefits of the principles behind the network like this. And maybe GNAM is sort of uniquely well positioned to do that, because in some ways business schools have an even larger responsibility, not just because of all the wealth and other things that are concentrated in business schools, but also because we're generating the leaders of the future. And for those people, I think articulating the importance of that perspective and of those values is extremely important. And so if Ted and others are thinking about the ways that the network could become active in addressing these kinds of concerns, I would say that advocacy is a super important.
Yeah, that was going to be, in fact, one of the questions I will circle back to. I'm going to ask each of you, what positions do you think your institution or the network should espouse in this context? I also wanted to get a few more reactions, Nida, to the proposition that Alessandra laid out.
I think I have to come back to the network, and I believe that the global network and the teams that we create, and the more we use of it, again, it combines to what aspects do we use of the network, prepares the future leaders to be able to make that difference. I mean, they get used to be connected globally, virtually, with diverse crowds and diverse teams. And yes, in the beginning, sometimes they have challenges, but I think it's a great opportunity for business schools to have the network and to if I may say so, give the opportunity and push future leaders to participate in that area.
Peter, your reactions to the question about
Sure.
credentials?
So I think it's fundamentally a question about differentiation,
Yeah.
and value add. So I think there are 4 elements, and I think some of the differentiation is gone. So the first is hard skills. I think I could teach financial engineering at Harvard, I could teach it at Oxford. I don't think it would vary a whole lot. So in terms of hard skills, and some very good work that was done by my former colleagues that characterized the state of business education, most of us teach much of the same things in our course. So probably not a lot of differentiation there. Second is soft skills. And there is some differentiation. For example, I have a relatively small school. Every single one of my students has an executive coach. Does that help? I'd like to think it does. And different ones of us have different things that we can do to help with soft skills. Because in the workplace, if you look at the surveys that have been done, employers are looking for soft skills. The third thing that's been mentioned is the network. You have some of the world's best researchers on social networks here at Yale. I don't pretend to know social networks the same way, but there are very many different kinds of networks.
Professor Chris Tucker is sitting here too.
Right. So there are all kinds of different networks, virtual networks, in-person networks, kin networks. I think that there are still differences with respect to networks. I've been blessed, and I think that's the only word I can use, to have been at 2 universities with extraordinarily powerful but very different networks. And it sometimes amuses me to see how these 2 networks interact. And I'm going to hesitate to bring up a 4th thing, which is attitudes and character, which is absent from our discussions. But I think that while we can't forge character in business schools, maybe it's a bit too late for that, there is something about attitude, there is something about character. And as business education has gotten more technical in many ways, and then we think about it being vocational in terms of soft skills, or we're seeing it transactional in terms of networks, I go back to fundamentally what character do we want to build in business schools? So there's a famous quote that was at the beginning of business schools: to earn a decent profit decently. What does decently mean is a conversation I have with my students regularly. Ted mentioned the 1776 publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith, by the way, graduate of Oxford, my college at Balliol. But the real question is, what did he write in 1759, which is the theory of moral sentiments? And I think that the job that we have yet to do, and where I see a lot of differentiation possible, is that return to questions about character and value. Now, in an international and global context, these are extraordinarily difficult. That doesn't mean we don't have them. So I still see the tremendous ability to differentiate. And character and value also then leads to questions about responsibility, which is not just the responsibility to do what you do at your job, but the broader responsibilities. So personally, I see lots of scope left for differentiation. And I'd like to think that it's differentiation that would be meaningful to employers, but more importantly, to differentiation that would be meaningful to people in their lives.
I was thinking, your comments probably resonate quite a bit with our students who are drawn to this institution also because of its mission-driven character and commitment to educating leaders for business and society. That conjunction has always been very meaningful to everyone attracted here. I was also going to go to John to reflect a bit on the question of differentiation, because you interact with pretty much all prospective students interested in business schools. I will also take a question in the back, but first you, John.
Yeah, well, look, credentials matter, and that's not going to change. You do get to a point where obviously your performance matters more, and that's the way it should be. But going into the marketplace, brand carries important characteristics. And while management education may be largely commoditized, the truth is the better schools, the better brands get better faculty, they get better students, the screens are tighter, and that's what employers are essentially looking for. And then the network you graduate into, and what that network and the individuals in that network achieve, also will help you throughout your entire career. Mm-hmm. So if you're starting a company and you need investors or early customers, or suppliers, you're going to get helped. And the strength of the network, i.e. the strength of the brand or the credential, can make the difference between success or failure. So I don't think that's going to change. Robots aren't going to change that. And I just don't think, you know, the way the world is going, getting more education, not less education, is going to be an important factor in how well you essentially rearrange the odds in your favor.
Great. There was a hand in the back. I'll make sure. Yes, please. Go ahead.
I have a question about the network effect from the student perspective, particularly as the students are maybe 3, 5, less than 10 years out. How do they currently benefit from the network you've set up, or how can you envision that they might? I'm thinking Berkeley Haas graduate working in Istanbul might want to benefit from the Coke presence. Someone from Fudan working in the Bay Area might want to tap into the Berkeley Haas network. Have you thought about mechanisms for students to do that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question for some of our deans. I'd open it up to anyone who would care to comment.
Well, we're sort of speculating here. I don't believe, well, the vast majority of alumni benefits associated with networks are associated with career activities, right? Sort of meeting individuals who've been through your school and with whom you have some sort of a relationship that's a little different than you would have with another person. It's possible, I guess, that you could extend those kinds of relationships through a network like this, but I don't believe career services have really been part of the conversation thus far, although I think it's an interesting idea.
One quick comment is that at a number of institutions, the Global Network Weeks have been opened up to alumni. And, or one could think of a parallel structure. I'm looking to see if David might be here. He could say more about how
Anjani, could I chime in?
Yeah, please.
On the question of benefits to students from the network, 2 observations. They go somewhat in opposite directions. We have found, maybe on the category of surprises, that executive MBAs value the network in ways that are just amazing. I mean, we have students coming to Yale and turning down other executive MBA programs to get access to all of the schools in the network. And it sort of makes sense, though. You know, they're very busy. They're not going to be able to develop that network easily, but to have programs that connect, it's very powerful. It shows a lot of demand, and I think they are benefiting. The full-time MBAs, since I and Anjani and many others here have been talking to our full-time MBAs about the network for a long time, we say when you come here, you get 3 potential communities. You get the within the school community. You get the, in our case, across Yale. Peter's case is across Oxford, et cetera. And then you get a network, you get a community from the network. And there's, I give them numbers on how many students there are and so forth. I think what happens with the full-time MBA is it's so intense on the first dimension of community that many of our students focus primarily on within the school. In terms of outside the school, most of our students take 1 course outside of the School of Management, and that number, that's increasing. But I'd say, to go directly to the question, it's now a selection of students who choose to invest heavily in the network. It's growing, but it's definitely a minority of students. And one of the issues that I think we need to figure out is how to lengthen these interactions and make them more frequent. So one of the things we talked about at length today was global virtual teams. We just started it last year. Students seem to want more of it. I talk to students all the time. How should we plan global virtual teamwork in the future? How much do they want? They vary in their answers, but they all say more. So it gives you some sense of executive MBA, they value this greatly. Full-time MBA, it's more of a challenge.
If I may add one
Please.
thought, that I think to keep the lifetime value of the networks that are so powerful when we share those years in our lives that are so intense in a full-time program, people are in general, I think in my experience, staying much shorter in their current employer. So we are having a diverse experience in terms of which culture we work for, which kind of job we want to do. It's becoming more and more fluid. So most of the people in our network are coming these days from actually work. And the minority of the people employed have gone through a top executive MBA program of a school like Yale. So if we could invest in nurturing these relationships over time, I think that then they are not going to be weaker. But if we don't do that, then we risk that people are actually over time going to get most of their networks from other experiences they have, because people are tending to stay much shorter in companies. So I think that having that in perspective should matter for the longevity of the value of networks, because people are much more digitally connected these days. They don't necessarily need to have studied together to reference the great work. We use algorithms that look online for unstructured information about candidates, just to know who are the top performers in a certain country. Mm-hmm. We might not know them, but the internet knows them a little bit, and then we go and dig deeper. So as much as it's so valuable, and I could not agree more, I think that the world is evolving in a way that we should reframe how we keep the value of these networks over time, because we have other access to other people in different instances in our life, mm-hmm. not only the business school, right?
Mm-hmm. If I may,
Go ahead.
I think we also have to mention that we collaborate also in executive education. And if we think of our students' careers, not only while they are students and right after they graduate, we have to look at a bigger perspective and think of their continuing education, not only during their MBAs, but also after they graduate, if they tackle through problems throughout their careers, when they think of executive education for themselves as well as for their teams, I think it's a great opportunity to be able to go to your school where you graduated from and be able to have a network not only in Istanbul, but also in Fudan, in other places. Mm-hmm. Because although we say that there are problems and restrictions with mobility, it is very common that our alumni work across countries.
Mm-hmm. I was also going to call on some of our colleagues from other parts of Europe. I'm especially interested to know how the situation seems in Germany. For many of us from the outside, it seems to be one of the few places left in Europe that is actively a shelter for people fleeing persecution. So if I may call on Dean Zoltan to ask how you see the effect of mobility restrictions.
So I'm joining Peter in welcoming the institution of being called. Lovely, thank you at this hour. Now, I was clever enough to make a few notes, kind of expecting that at some point Germany has to come up, right? Now, I'm Zoltán Antalmokos, and the name gives me away as being a non-German. I'm Hungarian, so I don't particularly feel qualified to comment on Germany, but I'm happy to offer a few comments nevertheless. First, even during this meeting that we had today, someone came to me and asked, so do you think Germany is going to win from what's happening in the UK, in the US? What's your expectation? I've had that discussion a couple of times for the past few months, looking at GMAT data, hearing from the most recent GMAT board meeting and similar. And My response is that, no, it's not a country against a country, and it's not like Germany is going to win in the light of what has been happening lately in other countries. It's quality that wins. And you can define quality in many ways, but the MBA market has been likened to a type of market which people call winner takes all. And this has to do with the brand, and John and others on the panel have explained some of the features of this type of market already. Now, the point here that I would like to make is that you cannot really have quality management education without taking global perspective, without being globally connected, without collaborating globally, and that's why it is a fantastic institution that has been established and has been running for 5 years, the GNM, and we are a very proud member of that. Also kind of recognizing how much benefit we derive from this network. Now, the next on Germany specifically. My observation is that, as you all know, Germany has always been an engineering-minded country, right? I mean, management education, what's that? I had this pleasure of talking to a top executive of a large automotive company in Germany, who said, look, Zoltán, we don't need MBAs. For every job, we have thousands of well-qualified engineer applicants. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm selling you an MBA. That's not an engineer, right? You might actually need at least one. No, we don't. Look at them, right? The car makers in Germany. So the country has been changing, transitioning, or transforming, maybe a better word to describe what's happening there. And no need to panic. Germans still know how to brew beer. They can still play football. So some of the values don't change. And despite recent developments, they still produce relatively okay, decent cars. But in terms of MBA and management education, it's been changing. Students are willing to pay for quality management education. And again, they pay for international experience, for global perspective, and so on and so forth. Similar to your school, we have less than 5-6% Germans in our MBA program or in our MIM program, and we have more than 30-35 countries represented in each class, basically. In a way, it's a bubble, as you also said. Also, employers are hiring, which is, again, something different from what you might have experienced like 10 years ago in Germany. Now, typically, of course, who is hiring? It's the Microsofts, it's the Amazons of this world, the startups, major hire, but also some of the, I would say, more enlightened German companies. Not all of them, but there are MBA-minded and there are non-MBA-minded firms in each country. But the proportion of MBA-minded companies is increasing in Germany as well. And if I can have like 2 more minutes, I would like to close my brief remarks on a personal note. Okay, so I'm a Hungarian. I was born in '61. I spent 30 formative years of my life behind the curtain. First time I moved for 29 days to the West, because if it's 30, then you would be an illegal immigrant, according to those laws, on my honeymoon, which was in '84, still before the fall of the curtain and the war. And currently, I'm teaching strategy in a room which still has the GDR national emblem, like the hammer and I think it's called sickle. Cursor, the drawing cursor. It's not the hammer and sickle, that's the Soviets, right?
Oh, I see.
It's the hammer and cursor in mosaic on the wall, and underneath you have a bunch of international talent, and we are discussing mergers and acquisitions. We are teaching capitalistic economy. And who is doing that? A Hungarian. And then my colleague comes in, he's called Konstantin Korotov. Now he's German because he took a German passport, but originally comes from the Soviet Union, if you wish. And he's teaching leadership. To more than 30 different nationalities in an MBA class, in a building which used to serve as the seat of the East German State Council, with Erich Honecker and other notable persons sitting there in the office, which now serves free cafe latte to MBA students. Isn't that bizarre? And now let me go back to the comment that John made. There can be historical hiccups. And we are currently experiencing a bit of a hiccup here and there, right? But there's no stopping. There's no stopping, and there's just one way to go forward. Because it's a very powerful experience, what I personally live, and some of my colleagues and my students, and you cannot tell them, now, go back to your corner.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
those comments. I'm going to use that as a sort of transition to the question that Bob raised, and I'm going to begin with Alessandra and John to ask what positions you would like the leaders of business schools, management institutions to take, to articulate, to espouse in a way that reflects some of this conversation here. And perhaps you should first say whether it would actually matter whether the deans of business schools take a view on globalism. So, Alessandra.
I think definitely matters, not only because we can be should be all vocal about it, but also I think what you were saying earlier about the 4 dimensions of differentiation, particularly in terms of attitudes and views of inclusiveness and respect for each other. So definitely, I think there is no discussion that is much valued and very much needed right now for people and organizations to be brave and oppose what's going on. But I think there are ways in which we can also have an impact at the micro level, because we all make decisions about staffing in general in our lives, in our careers, at home even, or in the business school or at work. And we can talk about diversity, the importance of being open-minded, etc. But if we don't surround ourselves with that and even kind of make an extra effort to make that possible, then we are not, I think, doing our part as well. So I think there are 2 levels of influence. One is obviously via the network and the personal view of the deans, of the executives, and of the organizations. But the other one is also which are the decisions we are making in our own power of influence, because we should not be speaking from both sides of our mouth, right? So is the staff of the schools diverse? Where do they come from? Or in my company, am I waiting longer for a visa to get ready, even when the job is open? Mm-hmm. Or I just go the easy way and hire someone who maybe studied with me from my same country? So I think we have to operate on both levels, the broadest level possible, but also make a difference in our own micro level.
Mm-hmm. John.
I look back at 2008 and the economic implosion that occurred, and I was shocked when so many critics mindlessly said it was caused by MBAs who were trained to basically short the economy, right? And to take advantage of the economy. And what surprised me about that was that there really was no business school advocate to make the point that that wasn't true. And here's why it wasn't true. And I think now we need a voice. We need a strong voice to explain the benefits of globalization to those who don't understand it. And because you're going to go in the same direction where there will be people who will be mindlessly arguing that business schools have led us down the wrong road, the wrong path. And a lot of the economic dislocation is a function of the 1% trained in elite schools. And someone needs to stand up and explain that's not true. Mm-hmm. There was a point made about income inequality. And I think it's an important point because I think there was a lot of second guessing when Trump won election, second guessing on business school campuses, in fact, and the notion that a lot of students felt that, yeah, they lived in a bubble because everyone was so shocked and surprised when Clinton lost the election. And I'd say a lot of the hand-wringing that came out of that was a sense that, we're not as well connected to maybe the mainstream, maybe people who have been disenfranchised as we need to be. And I think that there's some work to be done there. I think luckily this generation of MBA students are an incredibly eclectic bunch who do recognize the social responsibilities of business. Mm-hmm. And I think that the stakeholder model is making a comeback. and the shareholder model has been put into a better perspective and frame. I think we'd like to probably see more of that.
So that sets up a nice challenge and an opportunity for our deans on the panel to enunciate at least a preliminary statement that you would like to make, both on your personal behalf and on your institution's behalf, in any order.
I would like to also tackle that in some surveys. The survey that we had, we realized that our MBA students tend to have the inclination to work on more social issues, and they are more than ready to earn less in order to do that. But I think when they enter the corporate world, they kind of lose that social notion, being in a rough competition and having all the targets that they have. And I totally agree that it's, the crisis should not have been blamed to all the MBAs. But I agree, I think that also corporates should have some movement towards stakeholder model, not let it to all our students and all the younger generation. They have to convert for sustainability, they have to take more measurements in terms of corporate governance and turn themselves to stakeholder model.
Yeah. Peter, you're no longer at your former institution, but it's been the subject of a recent book, as you know, with a lot of the criticism being against the pure shareholder model as opposed to the stakeholder. So what are your thoughts?
Since my thesis advisor was Mike Jensen, I think particularly in the, so many different questions sitting in there. Where to begin? So first of all, I suppose, to the extent that we say that organizations are subject to the incentives around them, both implicit and explicit, so are business schools. Those incentives are rankings. Mm-hmm. Those incentives are donors. Those incentives are corporations that hire our students. I have seen schools be remarkably timid in some of their statements because they're afraid that some of those constituencies might be offended by what they'd say. Maybe because I have virtually no donors, and I feel less constrained by that these days. So I think the first thing is that one has to be able to actually say what you think. I used the word blessed before. One of the organizations that we've gotten is very supportive of the business school and the university at Oxford is an organization called the Elders. I don't know how many of you know the Elders. The Elders was founded by Nelson Mandela. It includes Mary Robinson, the president of Ireland, Kofi Annan. Yeah. It's a pretty cool group. Yeah. And they come regularly.
Ila Bhatt is going to be on campus this Friday.
So they've normally come a few times a year to Oxford. And one of the expressions that they say is that they're old enough that they can speak truth to power. Mm-hmm. And I once sat there in the audience, just like you all are, with Jimmy Carter, and he was remarkably frank about all sorts of things, as was Mary Robinson. And I think we have to be willing to speak truth to power too. Even when it means that some of the things that we're going to say will offend a donor or might offend an employer. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. So on the day that the Brexit vote came in, I used Instagram, and I Instagrammed the picture of a cornerstone of my school, which was laid by the president of the EU. And I knew that there were some levers in the people that I know. But on the other hand, what are you going to say? Nothing? So I think the first thing you do is have to say something. Secondly, John, I find your comments intriguing because they're so American-based. We're finally getting away from shareholders. Geez, it's only taken me 6 years to realize that the world is different outside the United States. But and
even after Mike Jensen advised you?
Even after Mike Jensen advised me, absolutely. And so on that, it's how do you start to think about more specific things? For example, job creation. We have a program at the school. It's a requirement of the program, or each year we look at one big topic. This year the topic is the future of work in the workplace. And we set this about a year ago. So every one of my students is focused on what's going on in the workplace, what's going on with jobs. Now, I hope some of them are going to create some jobs. And that's a metric that we could start to ask ourselves, to what extent are business schools the engine of job creation as opposed to only the engine of wealth creation. I think it's getting folks attuned to the issues of macro. Again, to go back to this little thing that we do. A few years ago, we had everybody focused for an entire year on demography and aging. 28-year-olds want to think about nothing other than old people. They don't want to think about old people, but the impact of having them think about old people and the business opportunities and the social implications of thinking about the elderly is massive. So there are times we have to do things that are unpleasant, that will put us in the line of fire. I'll just close with one that I'm very proud of. We could have continued to fill our class from parts of Western Europe and the US. And we did an analysis, and some years ago, 3 years ago, we announced that we would, by design, increase the fraction of our class from Africa from 2% to 10%. I think it's the absolute right thing to do. It is not going to help us with any of the metrics that the world cares about. On the other hand, to the extent that globalization is a big deal, my students cannot graduate without understanding Africa. Why? Because 1 out of 10 of their classmates comes from Africa. If it was 1 out of 100, then they could ignore it. So to put real numbers, at Harvard Business School, there are 934 students, 12 from Africa. In my school, there are 327 students, 39 from Africa. And if you say you want to be global, you got to do something about it. So to me, it's about being willing to make a couple of statements here and then to kind of risk a little bit in who you admit and what you do. Now, I'm lucky because the institution that I'm with is extraordinarily, Oxford is Oxford, and I have the right to do that. And I don't ever forget that I have the right to do that, and it's not an unfettered right. But on the other hand, you have to be able to do it. And the elite institutions represented in the global network, I think, are the kinds of institutions that can make sometimes bold statements and bold actions.
Bob, you raised the question. You get to have the last word.
I guess the way I sort of think about this issue is that one of our responsibilities as business schools is to create or educate kind of responsible leaders. And I like the phrase responsibility rather than ethics because it contains within it a connotation of guilt under some circumstances. And I think that it's important for business people to have a broad sense of their responsibilities. And in this world, looking at the nice globe that's circling around us here, it's clearly the case that some of their responsibilities relate to the planet, how people in other cultures are treated, and how their actions, through all of the externalities that sort of are replete in the world, impact the economic circumstances and outcomes in other places. So if I were thinking about a sort of a phrase or some advocacy that maybe the network could think about doing, I would sort of maybe start with some sort of a statement about responsibility and how globalization is related to the responsibilities of a modern business leader.
That's a wonderful note on which to conclude this panel. I want to thank our distinguished panelists, and I want to thank all of you for being a part of it. Let's give them a great round of applause.